Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the final panel as part of the Coat of Arms exhibition at Gazelle Art House, London. Today, we will focus our conversation on the history of AI in art and talk about the angle of computer art. And we're joined by a fantastic panel who will provide us with a little bit more insight into the medium and its history. Please note that if you have any questions, do feel free to paste them either in the chat or in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we'll be able to answer them during the Q&A section of this panel. And if you would like to see the Coat of Arms exhibition, it will close on Saturday the 15th, so there's definitely still time. And we'll discuss some of the works from the show, as well as kind of some of the techniques. And without further ado, I will pass the conversation on to our moderator for this evening, Douglas Dodds, who is a former senior curator of the World and Image Department at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And he was responsible for developing the department's digital art collection, and his curatorial projects included Chance and Control, Art in the Age of the Computers, Barbara Nessim, An Artful Life, Digital Pioneers, and The Book and Beyond. And thank you once again to all of our panelists and to our attendees. We'll start the panel.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks to Anastasia, Mila, and colleagues at Gazelle Art House for organising this event. I'm really pleased to be convening the panel for today's talks. We have two eminent artists, Frida Nake and Manfred Mohr, whose works are included in the Coat of Arms show. We also have two experts in the field, Zsofia Valyi-Nagy, who's currently writing a PhD on Vera Molnar, and Nick Lambert, the chair of the ComputerArt Society. I'm going to introduce them all in a bit more detail now, and then say a few words myself. As Anastasia says, though, we're trying to allow time for questions from the audience towards the end. So if you do have any questions during the presentations, do just put them in the Q&A or the chat. So we have an exciting time ahead of us here. Our first speaker will be Frida Nake, who probably doesn't need much introduction to many of you, but he sent me a few words actually, so I'm going to read them out to you. Frida is a mathematician turned computer scientist turned artist, but he really likes semiotics. He has taught at the universities in Stuttgart, Toronto, Vancouver, and most of his time in Bremen, where he's now supposed to be retired, but he just keeps going on. Frida tells me that he's advised almost 450 students about their theses, plus around 50 PhD students. So he's left a lasting impression there on the subject. I'm going to read his words out to you again here. Frida is convinced that humans are semiotic animals and computers are semiotic machines. Therefore, it's possible that they interact, but their interaction is most unsymmetric. For the animal is living and therefore dying. Computers have not the faintest clue of the two. I'm sure he'll explain more about that later. Our second speaker will be Zsofia Valyi-Nagy, who is a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Chicago. And she's currently a German academic exchange fellow at Humboldt University in Berlin, as well as a pre-doctoral fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts. Her dissertation project, Vera Molnar's programmed abstraction, early computer graphics and abstract art in post-war Europe, has also received support from the Daedalus and Fulbright foundations. As I'm speaking here, I can see that my slides are whizzing up on the screen, but I was saving them actually for a little bit later. Zsofia also co-founded the workshop series Speaking of Art, Artist Interviews in Scholarship and Practice in 2018. And she's also a practicing artist and holographer herself. A third speaker is Manfred Mohr. Like Frida, Manfred is considered a pioneer of digital art. After discovering Professor Max Bentzer's information aesthetics in the early 1960s, Manfred's artistic thinking was radically changed. Within a few years, his art transformed from abstract expressionism to computer-generated algorithmic geometry. Encouraged by the computer music composer Pierre Barbeau, whom he met in 1967, Manfred programmed his first computer drawings in 1969. He's had many one-person shows in galleries and museums, including famously the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris in 1971, the Wilhelm Hack Museum in Ludwigshafen, the Joseph Albers Museum in Bottram, the Museum for Concrete Art in Ingolstadt, the Museum for Kulturspeicher in Würzburg, and the Kunsthalle Bremen. Among the many awards that Manfred has received are the Golden Nake from Ars Electronica, the Camille Grasser Prize, an Artist Fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the DAM Digital Art Award, and the ACM Seagraph Distinguished Artist Award for Lifetime Achievement. And I'm sure the list goes on. Our last speaker will be Dr. Nick Lambert, who's head of research at Ravensbourne University, London, and is currently the chair of the ComputerArt Society, part of the British Computer Society. I'm sure he'll be saying more about CAS later on. Nick did his doctoral thesis on computer art with Professor Martin Kemp at the University of Oxford, and worked with Charlie Geer and Paul Brown at Birkbeck to recover the archives of British computer art. Thankfully, these works are now preserved in the Victorian Albert Museum. In a subsequent project, Nick worked with the V&A and me to research the computer archives of Patrick Prince, and he continues to be actively involved in the preservation of similar archives. Nick has worked with many digital artists through the Computer Art Society, the Lumen Prize for Art and Technology, the EVA London conferences. He researches the relationship of art, science, and technology, questions around digital longevity and preservation, and of course, the history of computer art. So that's the formal introductions to each of the other speakers. I wanted to just say a few words by way of introduction too, partly just to introduce you to some of the concepts that the rest of the speakers will be talking about. And I can see my first slide, I think, is now up on the screen. As Anastasia said, I worked at the V&A until relatively recently. As a senior curator, one of my specialisms was the history of digital art, or computer art, as it was often called in the early years. The term computer art was, and perhaps still is, quite problematic. It certainly had negative connotations for many people in the art trade in the 1960s. In brief, most curators and art critics didn't really accept digital as a medium that was worthy of attention, and very few museums actively collected anything to speak of. However, there were several landmark exhibitions held in the late 1960s, including the machinist scene at the end of the mechanical age at Mulmar in New York, some more beginnings at the Brooklyn Museum, Tendencies 4 in Zagreb, and Cybernetics Serendipity at the ICA in London. I'm showing some images here of the Cybernetic Serendipity show, curated by the wonderful Jascha Reichart. Amazingly, the V&A acquired its first computer-generated artworks as a result of this ICA show. I know that Nick will be saying more about it later on, but I just wanted to introduce it here, and also talk a little bit about the history of collecting at the V&A. If I could have the second slide, please. So although the V&A very foresightedly did acquire its first computer-generated works in 1969, I have to admit that many of the curators weren't actually keen at the time. I'm showing the official record of the acquisition, which, among other things, shows the whole discussion between various curators, one of whom calls computer art a characteristic aberration. and others use similar terms. One of them says, "I'm far from convinced that about their aesthetic validity." And they were talking about this series of 7 prints that were published in conjunction with the Cybernetics Serendipity show. I know that Manfred will show some similar responses to his first exhibition, first one-man show in 1971. Next slide, please. So this is one of those 7 prints that the museum acquired by the American artist Chuck Cezuri. And it's very much an anti-war statement produced in 1967-68. If I could see the next slide, please. And this is another slide from the same set by the Japanese group CTG, Computer Technique Group, called Running Cola is Africa. Despite those reservations in 1969, the print Running Cola is Africa is currently on display in the museum's Toshiba Gallery of Japanese art. So things have gone a long way since 1969, more than 50 years ago, basically. Yeah, if I could have the next slide, please. So now I start to see Manfred's work. So between 1969 and the late 1970s, as far as I'm aware, very little was collected by the museum in the way of algorithmic digital art. But the V&A did manage to collect 2 works by Manfred, and that was one of them there that was being shown. It was part of a set that we subsequently acquired, but we bought just 2 works in 1978 by him. I say we, I mean they, of course. I'm no longer at the V&A. Next slide, please. A few years later, in 1981, the museum also acquired its first work by Vera Molnar in a portfolio of works by many artists, celebrating the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók. And this one came, I think, almost by accident, because it was in a portfolio of works by many artists. Next slide, please. Moving on quite swiftly to more recent times. Again, the museum, like most museums, wasn't really paying much attention to digital art and design at that point, until the early 2000s, when basically I became involved and began to build up the ComputerArt collection, or the broader digital art and design collection. This image shows the American curator. Sorry, if you could just go back there. Yeah, this image shows the American collector and art historian, Patrick Prince, Patrick as in Patricia, who I first visited in 2003. This is Patrick in 2003 on the door to a lock-up storage facility in Pasadena. And in those rooms behind her are her computer art collection, or much of it. And she subsequently donated the entire collection to the American Friends of the V&A and then to the museum itself. Patrick died last year, sadly, and she's much missed. Next slide, please. Among many things in Patrick's collection were works by Georg Nies, Frieda Narker, and Michael Null, the 3 Ns as they were known. At the same time, though, the V&A also acquired the archives of the Computer Art Society, which Nick will be talking about later, I'm sure. So suddenly the museum had hundreds of works and managed to acquire lots more by other artists as well, including Harold Cohen, shown here. Harold's son, Paul, spoke very eloquently at a previous Gezelli event, so I won't say too much more about it now, but the museum has an excellent collection of Harold's work. Next slide, please. Nick Lambert and I worked on a research project funded by the AHRC, the Arts and American Humanities Research Council. And one of the outcomes was a V&A exhibition called Digital Pioneers, which I co-curated with my then colleague, Anna Bedard. In the background, though, you can perhaps just make out works by Manfred in the corner there, the 4 works from his scratch code portfolio. And on the far right, 2 very early works by Harold Cohen, pre-Aeron, basically. Next slide. And in subsequent years, the museum continued to build up its collection in any way that it could. For example, this early plotter drawing by Vera Molnar from her Interruptions series in 1969. And I'm sure Zsofia will have more to say about this in a while. And several works by Frida, including this beautiful set of 4 images. I'm showing just one of them, called Squares Turning Red. This is an original plotter drawing, one of 4, purchased with the support of the UK's Art Fund. And next slide, please. Oh, that doesn't seem to be displaying quite right, but it should be showing a Fortran punch card by Manfred, which is actually the punch card for one of his early programs, P21. So we not only have the image, we also have the program that Manfred used to create it. Next slide. And more recently, I also curated another V&A exhibition with colleagues Anna White and Melanie Lenz. It was called Chance and Control, and it was timed to mark the 50th anniversary of the original Cybernetics Serendipity show. Again, you can see works by Michael Knoll, Georg Nies and Frida Narker on the walls towards the left there, and some ComputerArt Society publications in the display case at the front of the image. Manfred, Vera, Harold Cohen and many others were in the show too, of course. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. And lastly, I just wanted to end with this slide, which shows the V&A's online catalogue of its collections called Explore the Collections. You can search for Frida Narker, for example, and you can find all works that the museum has by him, or Manfred, or Vera, or any of the other people that you might be interested in. So that was a very brief introduction, but talking of Frida, I'm pleased to say that he's our next speaker. So I'm going to hand over straight to him without any further ado. Frida.
All right, thank you very much. Doug, it's as a footnote, it's a marvelous experience to sit here at home and listening to you as you give that short rundown of you personally and V&A's contribution. You know? It's amazing. I have always known that London has played an important role in the world, the tiny world of this computer art. Thank you.
Thank you too.
I will not show you, whoever is listening and watching, any works, but a few sentences, if you like. And just reading this here, you see there is a difference made between a work and a work of art. And the concept, the history, the many, many manifestations of art are in between. So the artist, him or herself, I firmly believe, is not making art, even though she or he wants to do that. But what they are doing is a work that is nothing else in the beginning. They don't decide. Society, whatever that means, decides whether a particular work is accepted, gets the evaluation, the predicate, the level of being counted into that we call works of art. Society, that means galleries, museums, curators, art historians, all sorts of institutions, events, and individuals. They together, without really knowing this, create the art based on the work that comes from the artist. Next slide, please. That's my, in just a nutshell, really, my view of what we're doing. Now, what does now mean? In postmodern times. Think the image, don't make it. Now, isn't that horrible? It is. It is horrible. But it is what has happened by the event of the computer, by the infiltration into studios, other places, intentions, and so forth, activities of humans that have an inclination to do something very, very special, something that makes money in some sense, nowadays horrendously. However, they cannot, what they want to reach without society, the slide from before. Think the image, don't make it. The old artist has an easel and has a canvas and has brushes, different kinds of, but they are rather similar, has paints, and does something bringing the paint by using the brush onto the canvas. This is making, and there's other ways, of course, of making art, but we sit somewhere at a desk. We draw. What do we draw? Sketches, not really sketches that you want to show to anybody, but just what will be the elements I'm going to use in that program, in, speaking more generally, that algorithm that I am going to decide in order to force the machine, computer, to do something it doesn't want to do. The computer has no intention whatsoever, and in particular, no intention to do drawings. If it had any kind of intention, then it would be, please let me calculate. So you're thinking of an image, and more radically, thinking the image means that you think of a machine into which your hand is put into, all the manual stuff is in the machine, and you ahead of time think of what the machine should be doing. Think the image, don't make it. Next slide, please. Thank you. When the first exhibitions of that we here now also call computer art, and I put it always in quote, unquote, were shown in the States, they were proud. In April 1965, this was announced in the New York Times, in a short little note only, as the world premiere of computer art. I'm very sorry having to tell them that 2 months before in Stuttgart, Germany, without anybody talking about the world premiere of computer art, something there called generative art was shown. I prefer, at least nowadays, and I don't remember when I started to use that term, the term algorithmic art, because the kind of thinking that we may call, with some good reason, algorithmically thinking something, that is much closer than to what we are doing and what we are showing, than the fact that a computer, a particular machine, a particular type of machine is executing that. The work of somebody who does something that is accepted as computer art is thinking algorithmically. That's, I believe, the kernel, the nucleus. And next slide, please. This is a quote, the title actually of what Nick Lambert is responsible for now, from the bulletin of the Computer Art Society in 1971. It was founded in 1968 after some event in Edinburgh, Scotland. People got together, took the train back to London, and then created CAS, Computer Art Society. And soon enough, they allowed me, you see there in the issue number 18 of their little, very, very innocent little publication called Page, this note, there should be no computer art. Now, what the hell? This guy received some kind of exception, and now he says there should be not what he is doing. Where is the emphasis in this quote, computer art? There should be no. It is in the computer attribute in that term. I soon, I believe, resented talking about that if it was accepted into the realm of art as computer art. There should be a different term. By the time I was not brave enough or clever enough or intelligent enough to create a new name, that would have been better. But what I did was I quit. I decided, and I told Page a little before that, October 71, I told them I will not participate in any exhibitions anymore. Those that were already planned, I sent stuff to, but then that was the end until the mid-1980s. That quote there, reading it at least in the start, it seems to me that this term is nothing but one of the latest of these fashions, and think of op art, pop art, land art. During the 60s, there was a fashion to do something and next year do something else, and you give it a new art name. And computer art, I thought, was one of those that were continuing this kind of discussion, rather shallow. When the question was asked, now, is the computer an artist? What a stupid question, my thinking went. Next slide, please. There are, I think this is accepted at least on the continent to a large degree, and the French are leading in this, French postmodern writers, three really great media revolutions during the time of humankind. Writing, this is when speaking became in some kind an object, because it was recorded through the act of writing it. You could be sitting somewhere without taking any responsibility in being together with 10 others and talking, speaking, presenting. You were sitting somewhere solitarily and wrote something and put it out into the world, perhaps. Now, this took the second revolution to really put it out much later, the printing press, because you could now publish this and distribute it around, and there were people, well, they had to be able to read. That was the condition. Second media revolution in the history of humans. And if that is not too daring to say, and the third one is that we are living through now. And it has started, I would claim, and I stick to, I use those terms, the third media revolution, done by, with, through digital media, the digital, the computer, if you like, the algorithms, thinking of something without doing it, carrying it out yourself. That is a real revolutionary act of which many of us are not really aware yet in its deep I believe, impression that it already lives in the world, but will leave even much deeper. Only think of your smartphones, what you are doing there. It's called a phone. How funny. I think there is one more slide. Next, please. No? Yeah. No, stick to the red one, the one before, just for a moment, a second. Okay, yeah, here. Now, and now means starting in 1956, there are people in large numbers, and many of my immediate colleagues at the university believe computers have become intelligent, have the capacity of acting in an intelligent way. I'm sorry, in our beautiful context here, to say I do not believe this at all, not a grain of it. Computers are not born, they don't live, and they don't die. That's the heaviest reason against them being able to be intelligent. Yes, of course, all computer scientists, that includes myself, are working towards the following. Take some mental activity, this one or that one, and then try to formulate it in an algorithmic manner. That's the precondition for this to become a program that can then be part of a larger software package and so forth, and then the computer can carry this out. Where is the intelligence? In me, not in the computer. The mental activity that we started from, think for instance, preparing a drawing, that mental activity has now been put into a machinic form. Otherwise, the computer would not be able to carry it out. It has just zero intelligence. And the computer should really react and tell us, look, you call me intelligent. I'm not stupid enough to believe you. I'm not intelligent. That's my intelligence. There's one more slide. This one, yeah. Just a few dates, indications of, in 1965, you had those 3 exhibitions that are mentioned here only by those who exhibited. So Georg Nees was indeed the first one, has been mentioned. Michael Noll has been mentioned. Bela Juleš was important and that's the first exhibition in a professional gallery. Howard Weiss in London doesn't exist. In New York doesn't exist anymore. And then in November, myself and Georg Nees again. And cybernetic serendipity, together with it has been mentioned nicely already, cybernetic serendipity. One day later, in August, in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, then doesn't exist anymore, Tendencies 4 with the subtitle Computers and Visual Research. Look at the subtitle in London, The Computer and the Arts. I was represented and actually saw both of these shows. Fantastic. Fun, families, noise, London. Playful. Seriosity, research, theory in Zagreb. The wonderful fact here is cybernetic serendipity was a one of a kind. It happened the entire summer and into fall, and drew for the time, it's not really known. The estimates are between 40 and 60,000 visitors for the time. That was horrendous. Tendencies 4, the 4, what does it stand for? there was in 1961, 3 and 5, new tendencies, 1 and 2 and 3. The next would have to be in 1967, which did not happen. But in 1968, one day after the opening of Cybernetics Serendipity in Zagreb, dropping the new, only tendencies, but now not art, visual research. The world, I believe, this is why I stress that so much, is not really aware of what was happening there within these 2 days in August 1968, where 1968 is a fantastic historic date anyway. Is there one more slide, or is that the end? That's already next. That's nice, but I skip it. I stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Frida, for that wonderful presentation, as I knew it would be. I've got quite a few questions for you, and I'm sure other people have too, but I think we'll save them up for the end. I can see people starting to put comments in the Q&A in the chat, so let's leave them for now and come back a little bit later on. And we're going to go straight to our second speaker. Frida, you talked about the 3 N's. I talked about the 3 N's. We're now going to talk about one of the 2 M's, Vera Molnar and Manfred Mohr. So I'm not sure if anybody has used that joke before, but I've only just thought of it. So anyway, we're going to hand over now to Zsofia, who's going to talk about Vera Molnar. So over to you. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Douglas. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. Yeah, I want to start by just thanking Mila for inviting me to participate in this really exciting program, and to Douglas and Anastasia for coordinating it. And I just wanted to say quickly that it's just really exciting for me to be here with such legends. And I had the opportunity to visit Manfred's studio a couple years ago in New York and interview him and Esther Rose. Hope to be back at some point in the future. And this is my first time sort of meeting Frida, but hopefully we'll get to meet this year as well since I'm in Germany. But it's just really amazing to hear from both of you directly. And I feel like this rarely happens on these panels where we have practitioners and historians of different generations together. And lastly, Nick, I just wanted to say that your work in White Heat Cold Logic was one of the first texts that I read before starting my graduate program. So yeah, this is exciting for me. So as Douglas said, I'm going to be talking about the work of Vera Molnar. And obviously Molnar couldn't join us in person today, but she is still actively working now from a retirement home. But she just turned 98 last week. And, you know, with her hearing loss, it's challenging for her to attend these sort of things. But I'm an art historian who has had many conversations with her over the last 4 or so years. And we usually speak in Hungarian, which is her first language and mine as well. And I've spent a lot of time in her studio, both before and after her move into assisted living. But I just want to emphasize, and maybe this is stating the obvious, but I feel like it's important to say that my perspective on Molnar's work is only one perspective, and it isn't necessarily the same story that she would tell if she were sitting here herself. But I want to start with just a brief overview of her career, and then I'll address more specifically the role of artificial intelligence, or AI, since that's kind of the focus of our panel today. So you can go ahead to the next slide. Molnar was born in 1924, sorry, the next one, in Budapest, Hungary, and she attended art school in her hometown along with her future husband, Francois Molnar, and also the painter Simon Hantai And interestingly, another classmate was Peter Födes, who also became a pioneer in computer graphics, but more in the animation side. And all of their artistic training was pretty traditional and conservative. So it actually excluded the Hungarian avant-garde and the Bauhaus, which she would only learn about after moving to France in 1947. And as you can see here on the right, she made her first abstract works while she was still a student. And these are these images of trees and hills rendered in these circles, lines, rectangles. And then after graduating, the Molnars went to Rome on a scholarship. And from there, they went to Paris. You can go to the next slide, to become abstract painters. And they overstayed their visas and ended up staying there the rest of their lives. So from the beginning, excuse me, Molnar's art career really parallels these major developments in computing technology. So for starters, she really turned to abstraction in the years following World War II, which is also when electronic computers were beginning to be used for different kinds of problem solving. And this was following technological advancements made during the war, meaning, of course, that they were financed by defense budgets. And as you can see in this photo here on the right, the field of computing was dominated during the war by women who were known as computers. But then the gender dynamics of the field shifted pretty rapidly after the war as male engineers returning to the workforce rapidly took their places. Next slide. And then in the 1950s, which was her first full decade in Paris, Molnar turned her attention to systematic painting, which was an interest that she shared with a group of artists she befriended, including François Morlet and Jesus Rafael Soto. Next slide. Then in 1960, they co-founded the artist collective GRAVE, later known as GRAVE, the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel. And aesthetically, their work followed the tradition of concrete art. So this was this mathematically informed geometric abstraction that lacked discernible authorship. It really de-emphasized artistic subjectivity and the tradition of artistic genius that had dominated the arts for centuries before. But shortly after signing the sort of GRAVE manifesto, the Molnars left the group because they disagreed on the fundamental definition of artistic research, a term that we just saw in Frieder's presentation. And so François Molnar turned his attention to perceptual psychology research while Vera continued to work with the system she had developed around 1958 called the machine imaginaire, or the imaginary computer. And this was an analog systematic process for making paintings and drawings. And it was inspired by conversations she'd had with her friend Michel Philippot, who was a composer of electronic music. Next slide, please. So while Molnar was experimenting with the role of randomness in her artistic process, using dice to introduce chance into her programs, scientists were developing pseudo-random number generators, which she would actually later incorporate into her own computer programs, which you can see on the next slide. Great, so then the first time Molnar actually worked with a real electronic computer was in 1968, when she visited the French computer company Boule with her friend Pierre Barbeau, who is a composer and founder of musique algorithmique, or algorithmic music. And she had wanted to experiment with color distribution, but she was pretty disappointed to find that the plotters could only output in black and white. And so if you go to the next slide, the first works we have from this period are these sort of awkwardly hand-colored plotter drawings. And this one's currently on view at DAM projects in Berlin, if you have a chance to check out that show. So a bit of historical context I want us to keep in mind, which Douglas alluded to a bit in his introduction, is that these artists started working with computers at a time when they weren't publicly accessible, and also when public opinion was resistant and sometimes even hostile to artists working with these machines. And I think this was especially true in France, where Molnar was working, where the computer posed a threat to the very idea of art, which was and still is so important to national identity. I think Manfred can probably speak to this too, since he was working in France in the early years as well. And also at this moment, as we can see here, computing was a so-called blind process, which meant that you had to enter instructions using a punch card system. And you could only see the results of your program hours or sometimes even days later when, for example, a lab attendant handed them back to you on paper. So after these initial brief experiments at Bull, Molnar started working at the Sorbonne University's computer lab at Orsay, which is just outside of Paris. And this is where she'd do most of her experimenting in the 70s. There and also at the Pompidou's computer lab, which was called ARTA. And at Orsay, there was a time sharing process still in place, which meant that she would come into work on weekends and weeknights to use up whatever time was left over from the engineers and the students so that she wouldn't have to pay to use the time. And her work from this period was really a continuation of the experiments she'd started with the machine imaginaire. But with the real electronic computer, she could be more precise, more systematic, and more exhaustive in the execution of her programs. So that's to say that she could execute more possible outcomes more quickly. And if we go to the next slide, she explored a lot of the same themes, concentric squares or working with one continuous line. And the next slide, please. She would often transpose computer drawings onto paintings on canvas. So then in the early 70s, the Sorbonne purchased a CRT screen, an early computer monitor, which would output results in real time. And this marked a shift from what we saw as blind computing earlier to what we could call interactive computing. And interactive computing, the screen was referred to as an interface, which facilitated communication between the computer and its user. And this was a real game changer for Molnar because it meant less waiting around for results. She could try out different parameter changes without having to output everything to paper. Could we see the next slide, please? She could just preview the changes on the screen. So here we have on the left what it would look like on screen, although actually it would have been green on black. This was it appears white because it was a black and white photograph. So in other words, she could really shift her attention to comparing and evaluating successive images, which is really what she was most interested in doing. And she called this her conversational method, which comes from the French word conversationnel, which refers to interactive computing. Next slide, please. Next, forgot I had all those. There we go. So then in the 80s, the Molnars brought home their first personal computer, which was a BFM desktop that Vera's husband had gotten through his job at the Sorbonne. And this again transformed her process by allowing her to work on multiple projects at once. And I argue in my dissertation to kind of multitask on artwork and housework, since it really brought the computer into her home. Next slide. After her husband's death in '93, looks like there's a bit of a glitch there. Molnar developed more relationships with galleries and the sort of commercial art market. Oh yeah, here we have a work that was in the Coat of Arms show made at home on her plotter and the BFM computer. So since the early 2000s, she's basically continued to pursue many of these same lines of artistic research. So she often reopens these unfinished projects or kind of continues to do variations on the same theme. So like I mentioned earlier, drawings from a singular line, concentric squares, Durer's magic square, but she's stopped working directly with computers, and she prefers to collaborate with an assistant who handles the technological details. So here's an example of the way she works today. She makes these sketches, and then someone comes and takes a photo of it, and she sends it to her assistant in Germany, and he executes it for her. So we can say that actually at the moment when computers became a ubiquitous part of our lives in the late 90s and early 2000s was actually when she stopped using the computer. So she's actually never had an email address or really cared to use the internet, other than, you know, recently she's realized that when she has visitors, she can ask them to Google stuff for her, but still doesn't, you know, have a smartphone or anything like that. So I want to circle back and address this question of AI in Molnar's practice, because artificial intelligence is not a term that we see her using to describe her own practice. So even though the kind of popular discourse around the time, as Frida just mentioned, would refer to the computer as this artificial brain, she really resisted this kind of rhetoric, and she always insisted that the computer was no more than a tool. It was really no different from a ruler or a pair of dice. And the closest she's come to giving the computer any sort of agency is by anthropomorphizing it as kind of problematically as a slave, a sort of subhuman artist's assistant. So in this 1981 interview we see here, she actually says that she dreamt of having a robot she would call Vera Molnar, who would work all night long like a slave doing whatever I want. But at the same time, Molnar was from the 1950s onward immersed in this discourse on artificial intelligence, especially through her husband, who was her main interlocutor. And his library was filled with books on AI and how to incorporate these methods into his own experiments in vision and eye movement. And the Molnars were also good friends with Abraham Mohl, who was one of the founders of information aesthetics. The other one was Max Benze, who I'm sure Manfred will talk about, who wrote his dissertation on artificial creativity. But overall, I think that the aspects of these theories that actually influenced Molnar the most had to do with the way computers could disrupt artists' culturally ingrained ways of working. So this is referring to things like, sorry, could you go back? Not quite ready for that. So the aspects that influenced her the most had to do with the ways computers could disrupt these ideas that artists had about, for example, making aesthetic decisions based on things like classical rules of composition. So for example, what makes a picture look balanced? What is a good composition? And she also shared an interest with her husband in aesthetics. And I think it's important to note how much her practice, especially in the 70s, was not just about making pictures, but also about understanding how pictures are made. So I think that this AI question might be better posed as a question about generative art, which is, as we know, this buzzword that's become quite popular in the contemporary world of digital art. And I think that there's this sort of misconception that generative art is made entirely without human input, that an artist can just write a computer program, hit run, and let the computer generate pictures ad infinitum. And it's this reductive understanding of computer art that's invited comparisons to conceptual art, epitomized by this Solowit quote, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. And a line that I think is often quoted and sort of taken out of context to support this comparison is Frida Nake's quote, or variations of this. If we go to the next one, once a program is described, entire series can be generated. But of course, anyone that takes a closer look at early computer art can see that this is a near impossible ideal. I mean, troubleshooting alone makes the presence and the intervention of the artist during the execution of a program pretty much inevitable. But I think if we look at Molnar's influence on generative art today, the sort of key point is that the artist can play an active role in the execution of a program. So for example, if we take this quote from her 1975 article in Leonardo Journal, she says, whereas they, referring to other artists working with computers, begin with an initial set of rules or a grammar specifying the way parameters are to be varied, I try to elaborate the rules as a work develops. So in other words, Molnar's works are not autonomously generated by a computer program. She calls them computer assisted rather than computer generated drawings. And I think that today there's maybe a bit more of an understanding that generative art can refer to art that's made using an autonomous system, such as an algorithm that uses a pseudo-random number generator to some extent, but not, excuse me, made entirely with an autonomous program. Excuse me. So to conclude, I think, excuse me, I think that we shouldn't take Molnar at her word when she says that the computer is just a tool. I think that the advent of interactivity in the early 70s, for example, as well as the 80s introduction of PCs at home, really shook things up for her and changed her relationship to the computer more so than she's let on. For example, without the computer showing her these new images, these new compositions or configurations of shapes that she hadn't herself imagined possible, she really couldn't have realized her pictorial experiments, which were these investigations into aesthetic phenomena that she was always so interested in from the beginning. To me, that sounds like a human machine collaboration if there ever was one. But I'm curious to hear the thoughts of the rest of you on this. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that wonderful talk about Vera's work. I certainly learnt quite a bit there, and I'm sure many other people did too. I imagine Frida will have one or two things to say about it later on too, but that's good. I can see a few more questions coming in. Do enter your questions in the chat or the Q&A if you have them and when you think of them. But we're going to move swiftly on to our next speaker, Manfred Mohr, who I'm sure will be able to pick up on some of the things that Zsofia's just been talking about too. So over to you, Manfred.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Gazzelli for putting this conference together. And I have to say, I come from a family where everybody was a musician. Music was always my basic relation to art. That music as such is an abstract entity, and therefore art always had the notion of abstract. I was never interested in interpreting the world or copying the world. I had always the idea that in art, you create your own world. And at that time, I was listening to Anton Webern, Wolfgang music, and the first slide, please. And I was making drawings where the idea of sound and space was very important to me. Anton Webern created little parts of music like pop, 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 and there was space in between. And this space became very important for me as an element of creation. Like Henry Moore, for example, suddenly understood why the space between two blocks of stones are important, and so on. I was in a world of abstract geometry, abstract expressionism, which was also the time at that time. and I was comfortable with this. But then I suddenly got into something else. I started reading a book with a very provocative title, Programming the Beautiful. And I could not believe, what does this mean? And I read and I read and I read, and my whole life changed. I suddenly saw the world in a different view, and that was Max Spencer's view, that essentially what he says, if we can go to the moon, why should I paint a cow? And in this sense, I understood, well, that's true. We have to make an art which comes from the brain and not from an emotion. And I tried to think what could a rational art be, and I had no idea. So I started painting geometric art, like this slide and the next slide, for example. And every time I finished the piece, I had to tell myself, no, what's rational here is that I made a straight line, but the content is not rational. So what is rational art? And it's only a few years later, after this struggle, that I met Pierre Barbeau. We became friends afterwards, fantastic. He explained to me, and I related very easily to it, to music, how he composes music. That he writes little subroutines of different ideas and then puts them together, either randomly or not. And I suddenly understood, of course, I have to formalize what I want to do and then write it down in a program and then run it. And then I get the content of my thought visually afterwards. But at that time, I didn't know neither programming, nor had a computer, nor a plotter. So Barbeau told me start learning programming. And I started learning programming. I bought the only book which existed in France at the time. It was Fortran 4. And I started learning and I wrote programs. And at that time, also there was this opportunity that in Vincennes, we created a group and we had a little computer and I started writing my first program, which was a random number program. Because that's the basic thing when you want to make computer art, you need the random numbers. So that was a sculpture I made. I printed out the data and then I constructed with wood a random number sculpture. And from that thing, the next slide, from that time on, I thought I have to find a machine, a bigger computer and a plotter, because I cannot do this by hand. That's crazy, because the first computer drawings I drew by hand, and it took me like 2 days to finish a drawing. And I said, that can't be the idea of a computer drawing. So I accidentally and by chance, I saw on French television a program about meteorology. They just got a tablet croissant, a plotter to draw the weather map. And that's it. I have to go there. And I went there and I just introduced myself and said, how can I work on this machine? And I said, wow, you have to ask the director and this and that. And I did that, and I wrote a letter, and the minister received me, and I got the access, and everything worked perfectly fine. By 1970, I had access to the biggest computer in the world and a plotter, like a large flatbed plotter. That were my first drawings I made. These you just see now are done with a light plotter. It plotted with a light beam on photo paper. But it was the first time I saw the power of an algorithm. I almost cried when I saw the results, because you see, in art, you talk about variations. Let's make Picasso made 50 times the same head as a variation. But this is not a variation. This is the same logic, which is completely different. it has the same rules here 12 times, and that's something an artist never saw before, that you could invent an algorithm which does something with the same logic, but so different every time. And I got so fascinated, and I started writing linear programs like you see here. In a sense, I went back to my music background and writing sort of scores of music. And that's exactly what you're showing in the show right now. This whole series from 70 to 75 are all based on light music scores. But at that point, then I suddenly had this chance to have a show because somebody told the director of the Museum of Modern Art that I do some strange drawings with a computer. So he came to the methodology and was impressed and said, we'll make a show. So we made a show in 1971, and the company who made the plotters, they offered to install a big plotter in the museum, and this is here, and that was the opening. There's also Barbeau in the background. And I plotted every day for a few hours in the afternoon, and I had the most incredible, I mean, things couldn't believe what happened still. But the thing was that when I installed the show, there was one wall which was under a staircase, and you couldn't hang anything, and it couldn't be left alone. So we put a big board, and I put some paper over there, some computer paper, which Benson gave me, the computer manufacturer there. And I wrote on top, what do you think about ComputerArt? And that next one, the next slide. And that became, I think, the most important thing of my whole show, retrospectively thinking. The drawings, that was one thing, but that, you can look, this board is 3 meters long and 1 meter wide, and that everything you can imagine is written on this thing, from the most positive to the most negative, from the most vulgar to whatever you want. And it's a real slice through time, the fear of the time, of people, of the computer. I gave a lecture actually at the Vera Molnar's husband's institute, and I got a raw axe thrown on my head and say, you're doing military destruction of art. And it was a very strange time that people were so afraid that a machine can draw something which you define. And so that was one thing. So after that show, I thought about my own work and thought, that's too easy for me to write every day another algorithm or make some funny drawings. I should have some more unifying thing. And I thought about, like a music instrument, why don't I invent a graphic instrument, something which is always does graphic. And I thought of the cube. And the cube became my real instrument to play with. So I dissected the cube and studied what the signs are doing when you take lines away. So in this drawing, you see the left side, I take percentage-wise lines away. And what you see on the right side, that's what I took away. So if you put them on top of each other, it becomes one drawing. But I still was intrigued by the three-dimensionality. And what can I do about this aspect of three-dimensionality? Because I was only interested in creating a two-dimensional sign, like that was my idea. So I wrote a program and made the next slide, and I made a film to study the cube when it falls apart. And at the time, it was only a study for me to see when does the three-dimensionality disappear. And of course, it never disappeared because our brain is conditioned. We see even if with one line turning in space, we feel the space. So I failed there completely in getting rid of the three-dimensionality. And I decided, okay, that's an element of mine, the ambiguity. That's the first thing I took as absolute. And then after this film was done, I did all sorts of studies with a cube, taking lines away, made compositions, the next slide, and so on. And then after a while, I thought, okay, the cube is one thing. So if I cut it in two and rotate each part separately, I can sort of destroy the symmetry. I can play with destroying or taking the symmetry away and building out of that a new construct, a new sign. And that's what I did. I did for a few years. I cut the cube in two and did all sorts of stuff. And then the next slide, I tried with four, cutting in four, every time with the idea of ambiguity and destroying the symmetry. I create new signs. And I made the next slide. I also made growth, that it could grow like a biological tree, always the cube. And then I suddenly realized I'm not even interested in the cube. It's not the cube I'm interested. It's aspects to the cube. So I went 1 and 2 dimensions higher to study the more complex structure. What you see here is a 6-dimensional hypercube. It's the graph of an hypercube. And I studied what can I do with that, because the hypercube as such is also not interesting. So what I did, I found an idea to create diagonal paths through the structure. And this diagonal path became my alphabet of the next 40 years. Because this powerful line is a line which goes through each dimension once and builds sort of like a zigzag line. And this line I used to generate all sorts of things. And if you go ahead with here I went back to the 4th dimension, but these are diagonal paths through the hypercube. They are not diagonals, they are going through each dimension once. Like if you take a very simple square, when you go around the corners, that's a diagonal path, not a diagonal path. So I made all sorts of construction here. It's in wood, all the possibilities of a 4-dimensional hypercube. And the next one, the next slide, this is a 6-dimensional hypercube. I created this with a laser cutting of metal, made these pieces. So it became a whole new language for me, what I can do with this rotating or rotated diagonal path. And I cut also the next one. I studied the interaction between two diagonal paths, and did all sorts of. The next one is it doesn't come. It's another laser cut of more than 2 diagonal paths, and I suddenly realized again, standing against the wall, that how could I communicate to anybody that this simple few lines are complicated? And I thought, what can I do? So I said, okay, I fill the spaces in between this diagonal paths with random colors, and then rotate it on the screen. And that became my solution, because nobody can understand what a 6-dimensional hypercube is. But when the whole thing turns, you can feel that there is something magic holding it together, and it does something which has a content, and that was my direction then. So I did all sorts of directions, that the diagonal path would interact with the background, like it moves up and down and opens doors and closes it, or other ones where the hypercube becomes the next slide. Becomes a series, and a long series of rotation of these lines. And also then, if you go to the next slide, I took one of these diagonal paths and cut it up in pieces, like in even and odd pieces, and took it apart. And again, it became like a musical score. If you rotate it, the whole thing becomes lively. And then I took a diagonal path and made it transparent. and played with the transparency that it's like a ghost behind the diagonal path. Is not even visible except as a transparent color scheme. And then the next thing was that I let the diagonal path, here the white line, rotate, but keep the path it did. So what the yellow lines you see is what the rotations did while the white line was turning. And that became my next work then, that I show the path, what happened when this thing turns. And the next step was that I would, you see, I have to explain that the diagonal path is also the idea that an aspect of a hypercube. It's not, I don't show the hypercube. The hypercube is not as such interesting. But the aspect of an hypercube in this sense is like we have 26 letters in our alphabet. And this, we don't show it together. We choose letters and make a sentence or a word. In music, the same thing. We have 12 halftones in an octave. We don't play them all together. We choose and make like a melody or something. And that's exactly what my diagonal path represents. It's an aspect of a system which the system doesn't even become important anymore. It's the aspect which does something. And this is my latest work where it's not the edges which show the movement, but the line itself, when it moves in space, it leaves its trace here, transparency. And that creates this piece, which is in itself symmetric, because any diagonal path has also the opposite of it, and it becomes a diagonal symmetry line, and the whole piece is bent on the symmetry line. So that's what I'm doing right now. And to conclude, I'd like to say that it's never the system or the logic I want to show. It's what comes out of it. And the math behind, which I need sometimes, is only the vehicle, like the four wheels on a car. Otherwise, I can't move. And I think, as an artist, my artistic goal is reached if the piece I created can dissociate itself from its logical content and can stand convincingly alone and defend itself. This is my last piece. It's also a laser cut. It's a big piece of aluminum where, again, the lines created the form by rotating. That's what it is.
Great, thank you, Manfred, for that wonderful overview of your life's work, really. I can see more questions coming in, but encourage people to add more to the list. I'm also really impressed to see that pretty much everybody watching this evening's presentations seems to have stuck with us. So we're obviously doing something right, but we should move on. So our last speaker is Dr. Nick Lambert from the Computer Art Society. So I'm going to hand over to you, Nick. Thanks very much.
Doug, thank you. And I must say, coming at the end of such an excellent group of speakers, really, each hitting a very important area of the history, really what I'm going to do is perhaps to come back to some of the things that Doug originally raised at the beginning and give a kind of an overview, really, of some of the sort of how should I say, some of the concepts and some of the ideas that were active around the time that computer art began to become a thing, a recognized thing, and particularly in the UK. And the reason I come back to this is because a lot of the ideas that we're now discussing as part of this concept of artificial intelligence in art were previously rehearsed, perhaps in relation to the concept of cybernetics. And some of the earliest computer artists were actually much influenced by cybernetic concepts, and also incorporated these. So it's not merely artificial intelligence so much as something that emerges from a network of interactions with mechanical systems that themselves were programmed in various ways to respond. Some were computers that we would recognize today, some were more sort of analog machines that were somewhat different to our digital systems, but they all provoked some sort of response in people. And also this sort of concept of change, and the way that change and motion were being brought into art was a very important thing. So just two pieces to start with. One is CYSP by Nicolas Chauffeur. And Chauffeur, another Hungarian artist, actually also settled in Paris, active from the 1940s onwards, coming out of the tradition of kinetic art. Especially people like Molmar and others were very influential, and Namgabo also. But COSP was perhaps the first piece of art to be directly influenced by cybernetics, a self-contained robotic machine that would respond, in fact, to colors and noise in its environment, and was in its later form also mobile as well, and I shall come to that shortly. And then another piece that has always been very important and has been recently reconstructed. This is the Censter by Ignacovich. And my colleague Alex Ivanovich for many years wrote and really sort of re-explored all of the documentation and the remaining bits, because of course for many years the Censter itself disappeared. And this work, in fact both CYSP and the Censter were both commissioned by Philips, the Dutch engineering and electronics company, at different times. But the fact is the Censter made a sort of triumphant reappearance in 2018. Appropriately enough, back in Poland, in Krakow, at the AGH University of Science and Technology, where Dr. Anna Olszewska and her team reconstructed it, rebuilt the hydraulics, installed a new control system, and basically this sound-activated sculpture that responds to various sound patterns using a behavioral program is now active once again and is being exhibited, which is, I think, one of the best outcomes out of all the work that we've been doing on the history of this area, is that we triggered off the events that led to that work being reconstructed. So just to say, this history is by no means dead, and also it has a lot of intrinsic interest for current practitioners of digital art and AI. So next slide, please. Great. So of these early cybernetics and art people, you'll certainly recognize some of the faces there. I'm not saying that they're all computer artists per se, but rather that they were bringing together these ideas coming from, at the very start of the 1950s, Richard Hamilton with Growth and Form, then the independent group of which he was part, and then also John McHale, the exhibition This Is Tomorrow in 1956, and particularly McHale's idea of the expendable icon, and the way that not only consumer products, but also the development of audio and visual technologies were also impacting art as well. Then the notable figure of Gordon Pask there in front of a blackboard doing quite a late lecture, I think, for the 1980s, and his very first cybernetic machine called Musicolor, an early dance and light-activated machine from 1956. Jascha Reichart, of course, seminal curator at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, 1968, the Cybernetic Serendipity. Roy Ascot then with his that's one of his later paintings, but the concept of change in painting, and of course the idea of the ground course that he started at Ealing College of Art, both actually sprang directly from his nascent interest in cybernetics. And finally, Ernest Edmonds and Stroud Cornock, actually Stroud Cornock first in the white, and then Ernest Edmonds, the other figure in white, both artists and mathematicians who were working out of Leicester Polytechnic, as was, and basically coming up with the concept of the, in a number of interactive systems in the late 1960s onwards. So touching on a number of points here. So next slide, please. So we got one book that was, well, a book by Norbert Wiener, of course, from 1948 that was particularly influential. And then the Gababocus Common Room, which was a place where a lot of these ideas came together. And the point I'm making is that the 1950s were a time of great ferment in terms of contact between the arts and the sciences. And places like the one that the Tennysons, who were they were publishers who came over from Poland. They were also the aunt and uncle of Jascha Reichart. And this was not a coincidence, because it was actually at their common room that they ran in their, where they had their press. They also had a place for people from the arts and the sciences to meet from 1957 to 59. And basically that was where Jascha Reichart first encountered the term cybernetics as a talk there in 1957. And those sort of crossovers were most important. And as this concept of cybernetics spread around, I should have actually put a picture of Ross Ashby's book. I think that comes next. But basically, he actually touched on the idea of homeostasis, the idea that systems can react better to their surroundings if they react internally with many parts to things that change caused by external forces. So it's about balance and about the way that interactive systems sort of right themselves, rather like, of course, the way that heating valves can do so and that sort of thing. But he also mentioned a few key aspects of cybernetics that struck home with those artists who started to engage with the concept. So he pointed out that Wiener had defined cybernetics as a science of control and communication in the animal and machine. And the word from the Greek actually meant the art of steersmanship, steering something, control and regulation and coordination. And these, of course, are found in biological as well as artificial systems. And therefore, cybernetics dealt with all forms of behavior, as they said, insofar as they are regular, determinate, or reproducible. And he also said that cybernetics stands for the real machine, electronic, mechanical, neural, or economic, much as geometry stands to a real object in space. So, you know, this was a sort of overarching concept of how these different systems would interact and how factors in them, like a person interacting with the system, would change them. And he said there are two peculiar virtues of cybernetics. Please stay on that slide just for a second. If you could, oh, sorry, go back to, thank you. One is it offers a single vocabulary and a set of concepts for representing the most diverse types of systems. And the second virtue is that it offers a method for treating systems which are otherwise too complex to understand. So that's you know, two sort of particularly striking concepts that came out of cybernetics as well. And Jascha Reichart also mentioned, when she put cybernetic serendipity together, she made no distinction between engineers and scientists and artists in sort of the works that she showed in that show. And she said this, she said, it's assumed that electronic engineers represent a clever but uncreative branch of society, whereas artists are exceptionally creative, but it's unlikely they should possess any technological skills. These rough assumptions are broadly true, but not altogether true. Since the 1950s, the relationship between art and technology has been increasingly in evidence through the advent of computer-aided design. Okay, next slide, please. So in the early 1950s, a group came together called the Independent Group. Richard Hamilton, Nigel Henderson, John McHale, Eduardo Palozzi, and also Lawrence Alloway, Rainer Banham, Alice and Peter Smithson, two architects as well. And they actually were most interested in the intersection of the emerging consumer culture of the 1950s. They also saw a lot of potentials coming out of science for methods and concepts that could be utilized in the arts. And of course, the slide on the far left there with a frame-like structure, that's actually from the exhibition on growth and form. And basically that was actually Hamilton responding to Darcy Thompson's book about the evolution of different structures in the natural world in response to their environment. The middle picture, which as some of you may recognize, has got Robbie the Robot, and that's actually obviously a sort of collection of 1950s pop culture icons. That was the frontispiece of the groundbreaking exhibition This Is Tomorrow. And basically, this was all about taking a number of ideas around feedback and change. Lawrence Alloway's involvement actually meant that this was a sort of foundational concept of This Is Tomorrow, that it does actually include a table of different ways of creating, potential ways of creating art, and perhaps for the first time it mentions about magnetic systems, punch cards, the use of computer technology, and that's a very early mention of it, even though at that stage much more theoretical than actual. And the idea of the show also was that the viewer would negotiate their own path through the exhibition, and therefore, it would suggest different ways of interacting with them as well. And they took another idea from Ross Ashby, which was basically that cybernetics treats not things, but ways of behaving. It doesn't ask what is this thing, but what does it do? And those were sort of key sort of moments there from that. Next slide, please. So here we are. There's the front page of or the front cover of Ross Ashby's book, Introduction to Cybernetics. Now, Nicolas Chauffeur, who came to Paris in 1936 and did obviously a lot of work in the area of kinetic sculpture, but in 1956, CYSP was actually, you can see there in the middle about, it shows some of its interactivity in motion. It was actually mounted on a base with 4 rollers, and inside it contained the mechanism for moving the vanes on the top, the light sources and other things, and also what was called an electronic brain. It was actually an early transistorized system that enabled it to interact. Not a computer per se, but rather something that was hard-coded to respond to light falling on photoelectric cells. And that allowed it to respond to certain colors and move around as shadows fell on it. So dancers moving in its vicinity were a key source of engagement with the motive sculpture. And it took an idea directly from Ashby. It took the idea of the homeostat, which constantly seeks to establish a balance which is permanently disrupted, and explores lots of combinations of inputs. And that was actually, a strong starting point for Chaufeur's understanding of the really the sort of complex outcomes you could receive from the environment with a machine that just had a few relatively simple settings. And the fact this was mobile, it was a groundbreaking piece of sculpture. And Chauffeur also went on then to propose much larger works, including a city-sized interactive tower that never got built. But you can see the sort of scale on which he was thinking even at that stage. Next slide, please. So mention then of Gordon Pask, and as a really as from a psychological point of view in terms of the exploration of systems, the notion of cybernetics as a type of conversation that would take place between the environment and various people within it. Pask was also a groundbreaking figure, and he was also interested in the way that cybernetics could be used to teach. He devised a cybernetic keyboard system for typists so that they could actually learn typing much quicker, for instance, and also understood the sort of nature of games as sort of reflected in cybernetics too. And Musicolor basically was a responsive system with an analog computer behind it, and the idea was that it would modify different color and patterns in response to music that was being played there, but also as performers or dancers sort of went around, the machine would also really respond to the patterns and change the lighting that was there. And it was about the learning capabilities of the machine. And ultimately that led in various ways to the Colloquy of Mobiles, which was installed at Cybernetics Serendipity in 1968. And in this work, sculptures that were designated as male and female turned around the vertical axes. And in the males, there were photoelectric cells that would send light to the mirrors that were mounted on the females. And basically the system would respond positively if light would reach from one to the other, and visitors could interact by using mirrors of their own to actually enhance the system's interactivity. And again, this actually connects up with the homeostat and the idea of a system that would self-balance. So the really, that's actually, just to say, the reason why that color picture looks a lot better is because that was reconstructed by Paul Pangaro in 2018 as the 50th anniversary of the original. But Pask was also very influential on successors as well. If we move on to the next slide, please. Now, I should say Roy Ascott definitely discovered his take on cybernetics before he met Pask. In fact, he started making his change paintings in 1960-61. Of course, he's gone on to pioneer the field of telematics. And really, Ascott also benefited greatly from interacting with Hamilton at Newcastle, and basically the teaching he received there really sort of enabled him also to meet Nicolas Chauffeur as well in Paris, and Victor Vasarely. So there was a fair bit of ferment in Ascott's mind before he encountered the writings of F.H. George, a British cybernetician looking at the automation of business, and then he discovered Ross Ashby as well. And one of his principal contributions was not only incorporating the nature of change into paintings, and as he turned cybernetic method into really the underpinning of his understanding of art and the power of change, and the way that the viewer can also influence the way that the work evolves. But also he created the famous ground course, Ealing College of Art, which was a way actually of incorporating this behavioural technique and the nature of behaviour into the education of the art students there. Not very controversial for its time, but several sort of key people came out of that, not least Brian Eno. So this sort of telematic practice had direct results in the world. Later, of course, Ascott would move on to computer networks as well, but this was a key sort of development in the early 1960s. And you can see that one of his diagrams there connects all of these things together. Okay, the next slide, please. One of his students, of course, being Stephen Willett. And Willett has gone on really, still active today, still making cybernetics, and the nature of control, especially the nature of control, is sort of key aspect of his system. He called into question the idea of art as being sort of object-oriented. I mean, this is, of course, a work that he made. But in fact, there are, behind that, there's a system. And basically, this work was one of 6 constructions which were part of a learning system that he made, and they really presented the participant with a set of variables that could be manually changed in a self-determined order. And later on, he created a work called Metafilter, a sort of interactive console where 2 participants could sit on each side and look at various images of people, individuals, or various relationships on the screen, and then work with a thesaurus of 1,000 descriptive words to connect the 2 things together, and actually then sort of note down their writings and their understandings in a book that would actually then itself sort of become part of the work, allowing them to compare their responses and find a way of describing situations, and also the process that they go through really sort of forms part of the participatory nature of the work as well. So Willett's very much concerned really with descriptions, with systems, with the nature of inputs, and the way that those can actually change works as well. Next picture, please. So on to Yasha Reichardt. Now, I mentioned her background and the early influences, but it was also important that she not only went to, she met Max Spencer, of course, mentioned previously. She really sort of formed a connection there, and a lot of Spencer's concepts underpins what later emerged in cybernetic serendipity. But she also went to New York and met the participants of Experiments in Art and Technology, Billy Kluver, Robert Rauschenberg, etc. She was, I think, exceptionally tuned in to what was happening at that time, fully understood the implications of what art and technology, EAT were doing in that field, and I believe, sort of saw some of their experiments as well. When she came back to the UK and as a curator at indeed, assistant director at the ICA, she had an idea that she put to Penrose, the then director, and raised funds to actually put on the show Cybernetics Serendipity, seen by 60,000 people with 325 participants. It was in all respects, a watershed show. But the key thing, as I mentioned before, that she didn't actually clarify sort of who produced these works, but also she made it very much an introduction to cybernetics and to a whole variety of outputs: computer graphics, computer composed music, computer animated films, and also the early computer sculptures, and then cybernetic machines, of course, like Pask, Peter Zinoviev's electronic music studio as well. So there was a whole range of potentials there that she was exploring. And later on, of course, she wrote several books, including Cybernetics, Art and Ideas, where she was looking really at the sort of outcomes from that show. It toured the United States as well, and was, very impactful in all ways. But as she said, it was not an art exhibition as such, nor a technological fun fair, nor a programmatic manifesto. It was primarily a demonstration of contemporary ideas, acts and objects linking cybernetics and the creative process. And I think what's important as well, she said this, that the computer had far wider implications in the arts than what's been produced so far at that point. And she quotes the theorist Abraham Mohl, who said that the computer is not only a tool for making serial pictures or transforming an image, but is above all an instrument of democracy. He describes the imaginary museum, which contains all possible copies and variations of all works of art, as he said, which could be acquired as cheaply as groceries by those who want them. Of course, in the days when it was thought that generative art would actually democratize art in a whole new way. I think events have taken a slightly different turn, especially of late with NFTs, but nonetheless, there was an important side of the early computer arts movements that I think is overlooked, is the way that they actually looked at radical ways to transform, potentially transform the way that art was produced, and this fixation with the object, which had hitherto ruled the arts. A couple more slides. Next slide, please. So Edward Ignacovich, very much, should be even more celebrated. And I think thanks to the efforts of Alex Ivanovic and others, he's beginning to be recognised, I think, much more as a pioneer of interactive sculpture and robotics, in which, incidentally, he was entirely self-taught. Actually, his background was in sculpture. Then he made a living as a photographer. But actually, he was very interested in taking motion pictures of animals. And he was looking at, for instance, the motion of birds in flight. And according to the writings that Zsofia found, one day Ignatovic shot a sequence of a lioness just sitting in a zoo. He said the big cat was just staring perfectly still into space. Then it briefly turned to look at the camera and then turned back again. And he thought, what if you could go to an art gallery and see a work of art that would actually look back at you? Is there a point where that work could actually, really capture you in its attention as much as you are seeing it as well? And he was really interested in capturing natural movements using, in his case, hydraulics, and also in early interactive systems. The precursor to the Censter was a piece called SAM that was actually at Cybernetics Serendipity. That's where it caught the attention of a designer who was working with Philips. And in fact, SAM was an earlier iteration of this idea of a work that would investigate. It would come closer to you if you spoke quietly to it. If you shouted or talked loudly towards it, it would rear away. And just from those simple movements and simple programming, it generated a very complex, very lifelike series of movements. And that was the point with the Censter, that it would work like an animal, but also made its sort of artificial origins very evident. Philips, who commissioned it, put it into the Evoluon, a sort of a version of the Epcot Center that was at Eindhoven in Holland, and it was intended as a showcase for Philips's view of the future. And this work was as a centerpiece, was actually in a sort of arena at the center, and people would come and try and attract its attention by calling or banging on the wall around it. And the Censter would investigate them, move its head around. And as you can see there, it's on quite a large scale. It's actually standing nearly 3 meters high. Disappeared for a long time, as I mentioned, but it came back later on. And, thanks to, I think, the enduring legacy of Ignatovich's concept, a terribly simple but also very effective one, and one that sort of should be more explored. And he said actually later on, an unpublished paper, he said, it's very intriguing, the possibility of investigating and simulating the behavior of complete systems, both natural and artificial, and their responses to changing environments, because this leads directly into the realm of perception, which to my mind is a central problem of intelligent life. And he said a great deal has been said about the research field known as artificial intelligence, most of it uncomplimentary, and deservedly so in view of the many exaggerated claims and unfulfilled promises. But nevertheless, the understanding of understanding must remain one of the most inspiring goals of our civilization. So I think that's a keynote for these times especially. Next slide, please. So again, emerging from the ground course, emerging, I should say, from the influence of Roy Ascott was Stroud Cornick, who graduated from the RCA, the Royal College of Art, in the 1960s. And he actually joined a team then that was led by Ascott, looking at new approaches to fine art at the college in Ipswich. And he then developed a number of works and came into contact with Ernest Edmonds, whose own background was actually in mathematics and logic, but also was developing an interest in systems art. And the work that they began to collaborate on was an early network piece of computer art called DataPack. And really sort of a work that allowed participants, as they said, to have a pseudo-English conversation with a computer. And this work was, or the nature of the conversation would be processed by a drum plotter and then output in a visual form as well. And it was networked, and the idea was that it would actually be a computer installation near to the Tate Gallery in London. But in fact, sitting behind this was a larger sort of idea. And Cornick and Edmonds published a paper called The Creative Process for the Artist is Amplified or Superseded by the Computer. And they were really looking at the sort of situation within which the artist and the viewer sat, the sort of space within which art functioned, and looked at ways, as they said, that the computer could previously mimic certain aspects, as in fact this is what Frida was referring to, really, that the computer would sort of just be used to mimic traditional parts of art. And they said, well, what if instead there could be a sort of dynamic situation where the viewer has an influence on the work, and the computer actually mediates that instead. And in that respect, it's a form of communication rather than merely a form of imitation. That you have a computer here that's actually part of a conversation rather than one that's merely sort of creating a work that to some degree imitates what a human does. And this implication is and the sort of nature of interaction has underpinned a lot of Edmonds' work since. With Linda Candy, they've discussed a lot about interactive art practice. So it's gone on to be very influential, but also started then coming out of that sort of same interactive trajectory. One last work, ending really where things pick up with the Computer Art Society. So founded in 1968 at the IFIP software conference, but the three founders of the Computer Art Society, John Lansdowne, an architect who early on got into computing in architecture in the early 1960s, Alan Sutcliffe, who was a programmer at ICL, but very much interested in music and working a lot, obviously, with Peter Zinoviev and the early computer soundworks that he did. And then George Mallon, who also worked with Gordon Pask in systems research and later founded systems simulation along similar lines. And this work, the Eco Game, emerged from the early days of the Computer Art Society, where they were really sort of challenged to create a work that would actually incorporate some knowledge of computing, but also something that would emerge from a system. And as John Lansdowne described it, it's an algorithmic game created to illustrate the decision logic of computing and management. But actually what it did at a very early stage, this is the early 1970s, it looked at the environmental impacts of decisions about industrial society and industrialization. And it was actually in that form that it was shown. It was really about the chains of decisions that can lead to either a positive or a negative outcome, whether it be positive economics or positive for the environment, etc. And not only did that, it was the output of really a considerable group and a lot of thinking around the nature of the system, thinking really around what would actually come out of people working either against each other or sort of using a system of logic that was influenced by cybernetic concepts. And programmers, painters, behavioral scientists, sculptors, analysts, architects, electronics experts, and composers really all came together through Computer Art Society to make that work. It was shown both at Computer Graphics 70, but also at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, in what's become, of course, the infamous conference in Davos. And some concepts were actually used by staff at Vera as well later on for the machinery design for Chile. So this really sort of is an end point for this talk, but also is a stepping off point then for what the Computer Art Society went on to do and where that took it. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that fascinating talk. Very useful and a good sort of perspective on an aspect that otherwise might have been a bit neglected. So thank you for that. We've got quite a few questions and comments that have come in. I'm conscious though that we're starting to run out of time. There's been some very nice complimentary statements in the chat. I'm going to try and just pick out one or two questions, some of which are aimed at particular speakers, some of which have been picked up in the talks. There's one for Manfred, which says, Manfred, what is your attitude to artificial intelligence?
I don't know what to say. Artificial intelligence is anything and nothing. I am not into promoting artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is something which is me as an artist not accept. I mean, I don't reach to that. It's the machine is something.
Mm-hmm.
Humans is something else. I am not able to transpose my thinking into the machine, that it gets automatic, I mean, autonomous doing something what I would like to do. I only can get this to a certain degree by programming, but I don't consider this artificial intelligence.
Right.
It is my intelligence, you know, which I, like Frida said, I give to the machine to work with it. But artificial intelligence is something completely different. And I think none of the work which has here anything to do with artificial intelligence.
Right, thank you.
Artificial intelligence is something that a machine creates itself, and we don't have that machine.
No.
And I don't think that there is any art
It's
done
good.
as artificial intelligence.
Frida, I can hear you coming in there. There's an interesting question for many of us, actually. Could the panelists share their thoughts on the difference and similarities between digital work that manifests as physical artifacts, pen plotters, laser cut, compared with digital work that remains digital, i.e. on the screen? Many of the early works are physical, aren't they?
I once discussed with Frida exactly about this, and I had my own ideas. I always thought that since the beginning, people say, what is, I mean, computer art, digital art, whatever you want to call it. Is it the program? Is it what the program does as a file? Or is it the realized work? Doesn't matter if it's laser cut or printed or drawn. There are three states which are in fact one. I compare it to water, ice, and steam, which is the same thing, but it has so different aspects that they don't fit together. And I see computer art like that. It exists in different forms.
May I add, Doug?
Please do.
Just add one sentence. The analog and the digital belong together. They cannot be separated. When the person who asked the question says, how about art that remains digital, only appears on the screen? When it appears on the screen, it becomes visible, therefore it is now analog. We cannot separate them.
Thanks. Another interesting topic, which we haven't really talked about much today, but one attendee has said, I'm wondering, in surveying and collecting the early works of computer art, if any consideration was given to computer animation pioneers like John Whitney Sr., Lillian Schwartz, and many others. I'm often discouraged by art historians who simply don't consider any works on film or video as works of art. If I could just say one thing about that, in the V&A show that we did in 2009-10, we did actually include works by Lillian Schwartz and a series of animations on small screens in the gallery, even though it was a prints, drawings and paintings gallery. We also included various shows during the various projections during the lifetime of the exhibition to try and bring those works into the discussion as well. But perhaps somebody else might like to add more to that.
Yes, just on that, I mean, you know, John Whitney is often seen as you know, the earliest pioneer of computer animation because, of course, he's producing things on an analog computer. Lillian Schwartz's, you know, status, I think, both in sort of visual art and animation is established too. So I would say that they are beginning to be recognised. I think it's more about the, as you were saying, the problems in collecting them, perhaps, or sometimes just finding where the source material is at some stages can be quite difficult.
Yeah, and also including the people who work with them. I'm thinking of people like Ken Knowlton, for example.
Yes, indeed.
Who also needs to get the credit there. But Manfred, you actually had an animation, didn't you? Your cubic limit.
I did in 1973. I made a computer movie. I wrote a program. I wrote a whole bunch of movies. I made 4 different movies, but it was sort of not my thing. I was not a filmmaker. I just tried to figure out certain things there. It was the 3-dimensionality and the probabilities of you know. So I never considered my films as my major work, you know, but over the years, whatever, you know, if you wait 50 years, it becomes important. So this film, in a sense, becomes a very important piece in my history. But I wasn't intending to make a computer film. I was just playing in a sense.
Zsofia, did you have something to add?
Yeah, if I could just quickly add, I do agree that that bias exists, and I think some of it might have to do with what Douglas just alluded to, with, you know, different departments and different museums, and kind of there not being, you know, communication or budget to allow the collaboration across them. But I just wanted to say, for example, in my own scholarship, I work on kind of like the history of the screenshot, or like these kind of photographs of screens. And so that, for example, is an area in which the animation and the kind of still images really converge. And it's kind of impossible to tell the history without those filmmakers that you're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah.
One other thing, very, very quick observation as well. I think it's sometimes a problem of terminology or nomenclature, because Whitney could also be grouped as an abstract animator with Jordan Belson and people like that as well. And, you know, frequently that's, you know, he's in that history, although he's very much in the computer history too. So, I mean, I think the two, yeah, that has to be recognized, that these people cross over into other areas as well.
Yeah. Frida, one last word from you.
The work of art that comes from the computer should really be considered as a double. The perceivable surface for us and the non-perceivable but computable subface, I suggest, for the computer. And the real capability of the computer is reached then when, in the gallery, let's assume, we see on a screen something happening that is now being produced and will never, within the next 100,000 years, be repeated, because the computer is running as we see the work.
Right. I think with that wonderful final statement, we should probably draw to a close. But thank you all for your presentations, and thank you to everybody for attending. It's been a great event, and I wish we could go on for much longer. Maybe we should have a second one sometime soon, or even better, meet in person.
You are such a friendly person, Doug.
Even have a tour of all the different wonderful locations that we're all sitting in. But sadly, we have to go. So thank you all for attending. Thank you to everybody listening. Thank you most of all to Gazelle Art House for organising the wonderful exhibition, which is still on for a few more days. So I highly recommend it. Do try and get to it if you possibly can in London. And I believe they're also going to be making a recording of this evening's events available online fairly soon. So do look out for that too. Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone from Gazelle needs to add anything to that, but that's all from me.
Yes, absolutely. And I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us here, and thank you for taking the time. It's been absolutely amazing and very, very insightful to hear from all of you, and Zsofia, from you as well, to describe kind of Vera's perspective on Vera's work. We hope to kind of continue these dialogues and conversations. And once again, thank you very much for your time and for joining us this evening. Hopefully see you all in London or in Germany or the US.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.